Welcome, everybody.
Welcome.
I'm Richard Howarth with Square Books. I occasionally think in wonderment of the days that many great writers and figures have been here at Square Books over the past 42 years. And I think today with Margaret Burnham and Barbara Phillips is one of those days. And I'm going to get to them in a moment. But first, a few announcements about upcoming events. Tomorrow, Thacker Mountain Radio will be at the Powerhouse. Mississippi poet C.T. Salazar will be a guest reading or reciting from his debut book, Headless John the Baptist Hitchhiking. I'll say that again. Headless John the Baptist Hitchhiking. On Friday, beginning at 11 a.m., we will host Coach Mike Bianico and star player Tim Elko here signing copies of the new book that celebrates the University of Mississippi baseball team's current College World Series championship title. Details at the main store. It's very complicated. On Tuesday, we will be here at Off Square Books with Ian Tran, the Vietnamese American writer from New Orleans, with her novel, Daughters of the New Year. And then next Thursday, Thacker Mountain will celebrate its 25th anniversary with a show that includes Indisha Filial, author of the National Book Award finalist, The Secret Lives of the Church Ladies. Some of you may have heard her here, and that was a remarkable reading, so I encourage you, those who will only be doing a little bit, to go to Thacker Mountain to hear her. Today we are honored, as I say, to host Margaret Burnham, author of the very recently issued by hands now known Jim Crow's Legal Executioners. Published by Norton, the book has drawn much early praise from review media. Next year, by the way, Norton will celebrate its 100th year, and it's one of the great publishing companies in the history of American book publishing. And I discovered recently that her editor there is John Glussman, who is also Curtis Wilkie's editor at Norton. So, nice coincidence there. Margaret Burnham is an Alabama native, graduate of Tougaloo and the University of Pennsylvania School of Law. Her service is distinguished in many ways. In 1970, she was on the legal defense team for Angela Davis, a childhood friend, and as an attorney on the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And in 1977, she became the first African-American judge in the state of Massachusetts. Having served on numerous important civil rights cases, she founded the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project at Northeastern University and was appointed by Joe Biden as a member of the Civil Rights Cold Case Review Board. She is in conversation today with, I would say, the equally astute Barbara Phillips, former law professor here at the University of Mississippi, who has her own distinguished record in voting rights, civil rights cases. Let's welcome our distinguished guest today.
I think I made it up here.
You sure you guys not sisters? You look alike.
I am often mistaken for one of the Burnham sisters. And I could use those words too. That's another conversation. So I thought we would start. I did read the book, but I want to read this blurb from Martha Minow because I think it really conveys what this book is about. And you might think that this book is very hard reading, and it is, because it reveals to us the details of white terrorism in the South during a period of time for which there are still some living folks who remember it. Let me read what Martha says. Defying national suppression and indifference by hands now known, vividly conveys the stories of those whose lives were destroyed by previously undocumented racial violence between 1920 and 1960. Margaret Burnham, drawing on a painstakingly constructed database, launches a vital and restorative reckoning with the reprehensible devastation of lives, communities, justice, and memory. And so we're going to talk about this book, and we're going to talk about this project that Margaret founded at Northeastern Law School, but sort of separately. And I think it's fitting that we have this conversation in the hometown of LQC Lamar, who is still honored in this town. And I want to just read what he wrote in the Declaration of Secession for the state of Mississippi. This is the declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify secession. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. So here we are in LQC Lamar, so we can talk about this. And we're in Mississippi, and you know we like to tell stories, and we like to start with family. And I want to start where you begin, really, this book, with the dedication. In honor of my parents, Lewis Everett Burnham and Dorothy Challenor Burnham, whose gift to me was this cause. Will you tell us something about your parents, and what is this gift? What is this cause?
Well, thanks so much, Barbara. Let me just first say how thrilled I am to be in Oxford among friends and new friends. And particularly, before I get to my parents, let me just say I'm so pleased to have my colleague, Professor Rose Zoltek-Chick, who's traveled with me from Boston and who has traveled along this road with me for so long. And I'm also pleased, so pleased to be reunited with my dear friend, Mayor Diane Freelon Foster, Mayor of Grenada, and her friend and partner, Glenda. Thank you so much for traveling to join us. And also really happy to be among the folks who have raised up the name of Elwood Higginbotham here, the Scotts, and Effie. Thank you so much for the work you've done. And I want to also thank our host, Richard Holworth, for keeping reading alive in this town, which has given so much to American letters. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I'm also pleased to be in the same room with Curtis Wilkie, who held up the flame of journalism in Boston for so long. So it is a real thrill and pleasure to be here today. My parents left New York City, where they were raised, to go to Birmingham, Alabama in the 1940s. And they worked there, an organization called the Southern Negro Youth Congress, for a number of years until 1948. When we were all born in Birmingham, and so did Union Hospital in Birmingham. And they left in 48, having been chased out of the town by none other than Paul Connor, and returned to New York, which is where I was actually fully raised. New York, I did come back south because my parents, and I would say particularly my dad, kept that Southern time with him, and it was the landscape on which we painted our own lives for many years, even though we were New Yorkers. The beauty of the South, the complexity of the South, and the horrors of the South, the warmth of the South, like no other place in our country. All of those things, he kept with him, and so it stayed with me. And the gift is the gift of commitment to a better South and a better country.
Your book focuses on the time period 1920 to 1960. Why? Why that time period? Why the South?
Well, let me just say first that let me say a word or two about our project, because it's the project that informs the book. So the project really came about because we were looking at the efforts of journalists and lawyers to revisit civil rights crimes from the civil rights era. And from there, we left that period and moved into the 1930s and 40s, where we found an abundance of cases that had never actually been turned over. So, many of the cases, certainly the case that Curtis Wilkie writes about, the Vernon Dama case out of Hattiesburg, and those other cases out of Mississippi, 1960s, they've been pretty well explored. There's always more to say, of course. But we found that so little had been written about this period, the period in which my parents were active, in the 1930s and 1940s, and that there were, as you said, Barbara, there were family members who wanted explanations, wanted information. And so as a law school, we thought, we'll put our students on this. And we just began digging, looking at old newspaper articles, and then digging up official records, government records, so that we could piece together these cases and ultimately create an archive. The archive itself, which is available for anyone, and I hope all of you to take a look at, was published last week. It's at crrjarchive.org, crrjarchive.org, one word. And it includes 1,000 cases from 1930 to 1955. And most of those cases, all of those cases really, are from the former Confederate states, which obviously includes this particular state. And so that's the archive. And obviously we put this frame around it because previous work had been done by other scholars from the late 19th century through 1930, and we were pretty convinced that, as I said, most of the post-1940, 54 cases were more readily available. So the book starts in the 1920s because I tell the story in the book about the unity between communities in the South and those in the places to which Southerners had escaped. Detroit is the city I focus on, in trying to confront, overcome, and provide remedies for Jim Crow era violence. And so the early cases in the book are really about people who survived the violence. The only way they survived was by getting out of Dodge quickly. And so I tell 3 stories, one from Pensacola, a woman from Pensacola who runs up to Detroit, another Mississippi story from, this town is going to escape me, Bentonia, a couple in Bentonia, late 1930s, involved in a street killing of a white man, and the couple has to get out of town and hide in the bushes. All slavery style escapes, and ultimately end up in Black Bottom in Detroit, African American community in Detroit. And so the first chapter is really about how they're received, and the third is the case out of Louisiana, New Orleans. So the first part of the book starts with how these people are received in the sanctuary state, in this case Michigan, Detroit. And I tell that story because I think it sets, first of all, I try to draw the lines from the Underground Railroad through this rendition period, and talk about the ways in which law shapes the relationships between these two states, where obviously one country at this time, but with very, very different attitudes about these issues. And so I talk about the role, for example, of Frank Murphy in Detroit, who ultimately became Supreme Court Justice, but started off as a political figure in Detroit, was the mayor of the city, and then a judge, and then he handles some of these rendition cases, and says to the Mississippi governor who's looking for his people back, no, we're not sending them back. We're not sending them back to lynch mob. So I talk about the nature of federalism during this period of time, the connections between these black communities, North and South, and particularly, Barbara, you find this interesting as a lawyer, I talk about the very intricate lawyering that took place in Detroit to keep these folks in that town. Now, of course, once they won their cases, and then two, they won and one they didn't, they were limited to Michigan. So they were essentially, the boundaries of their lives were in the state of Michigan, where they had gotten sanctuary. They couldn't pick up and leave and go to another state because the governor would, then seek their extradition from that other state. So the couple that I talk about from Bentonia, I sort of trace them back to slavery, talk about, they were related to a very famous blues man named Henry. Any of you know anything about the blues? Henry Stuckey was a famous blues, the Bentonia blues really comes from Henry Stuckey. Excuse me for a second. So Henry Stuckey goes to World War I. So I can beat any Mississippian on storytelling. So Henry Stuckey, he starts, he goes to World War I with his cousin from Bentonia, and he's ends up an orderly in a hospital, and there he meets some musicians from the Caribbean who over there fighting World War I and are patients of Henry Stuckey's. And they teach him how to play the guitar in a certain way. And he brings that back. I'm not a musicologist, I promise anyone who is, but he brings that special that special kind of Caribbean string playing back to Bentonia, which becomes the source of what we call now the Bentonia blues. So that's the chapter, the Bentonia blues.
And I can attest, the book is filled with great storytelling. Okay. Now, one of the things you do in your analysis, Margaret, is that you place this white terrorism as a function not just of race hatred, but you place it as something that functions with controlling free labor. And so there's an economic analysis, an import to this that makes it more complicated than simply controlling black folks. Could you say a little bit more about that?
I'm not an economist, and I'm going to stick with my area of specialty, which is law. There are other disciplines, the economists and sociologists have really looked at the correlation between racial violence, and in particular they look at lynching and economic issues, economic phenomena in the South. And so, there's a lot of theories out there that the lynching era was designed to terrorize African Americans and therefore keep them on their plantation, or scare them away from leaving their plantation. All that is at play here. So there are a lot of theories about the relationship between violence and the economic development of the South. What I look at in one chapter of the book is the relationship between violence and union organizing in Birmingham, Alabama. And you all know that Birmingham's a union town from the 1930s, was a union town, but also a deeply segregated town. And so I look at the ways in which violence serves, the mine owners, they call them big mules in Birmingham, in keeping white workers and black workers, all of whom had common cause, of course, in the mines, and all of whom worked closely together at their work sites, mostly underground, but also overground. Just igniting racial hatred becomes part of the system of control in Birmingham, just as it was in apartheid South Africa. In effect, it keeps folks who have common interests from acting on those common interests, and keeps them fighting.
Margaret, we now have here in Lafayette County a public acknowledgement of white terrorism. As you point out in your book, Lafayette County is among the top 5 counties in Mississippi for having the most lynchings. So across the street here, we have a plaque that is dedicated to 7 victims of lynching here in Lafayette County, and our work in achieving the placement of this plaque and the commemoration of what happened here is in part attributable to the work of your project. And in fact, I think one of your students, what is the girl's name?
Kylie Burke.
Yes, Kylie Burke was here when we had the commemorative ceremony. And I want to point out that our Lafayette Community Remembrance Project, assisted by your project, did this work. And we learned that Elwood Higginbotham was not only a sharecropper, but he was a labor organizer.
Yes.
And he was lynched here in 1935. So, tell me something about how this particular case came through your project.
So as with many, first of all, I'm really proud of our project's long-time relationship with April Grayston here. I know she couldn't be here tonight, but she's just done utterly fabulous work and provided a model not just for Lafayette, but for folks all around the world all around the country, who are trying to figure out ways to enliven and share this history. And before April, Susan Glisson, I think is also part of your community, and just did wonderful work here. And we've worked closely began working closely with Susan in 2007. My good friend Diane. So the way our students start is with whatever documents are readily available, and that might be a newspaper article. And then they begin building a file. So obviously we're in a law school, so they have to know about how to create a file, how to reconstruct, reverse engineer, we call it, a case. And so we tell them, get as much information as you can. Get all the secondary literature, do that first. And then when you find out nothing's been written on the thing, or that maybe there's a paragraph in some PhD thesis that's never been, has not, seen the light of day, then go after the case. If it has seen the light of day, we're not spending our time on it. But if you find a case that should be but hasn't been adequately treated, then grab onto that and work with it. And I don't remember what the first item was that our student found. The student's name is Kylie Burke, that she found in the Higginbotham case. But she was in touch with someone who suggested to her that the case may well have inspired a piece of writing by William Faulkner. And this is I think it's 1930, am I right, 1935? 1935. So he would have been alive and well and walking the streets of this beautiful town back then. And so she went after it, and she began to build a file. And ultimately we realized that we couldn't complete this work as with most of our cases. You got to go there to know there. And so the students have to go to these places and meet folk who can help them fill in the blanks. You get the family history, that sort of thing. And so she came here long before April got involved. We sent her down here with another student, we'll also always send them in pairs. And that parenthetically is because if you're a lawyer and you're going out to interview someone, you want someone else there because you want that other person to hear what it is you're hearing in case they need to testify. So again, this is about training lawyers too. So the two students come down here, and thank you for the pronunciation. I would have said Lafayette, but you all don't say that here. Yeah, I'm so sorry. Okay, I stand corrected. I'm gonna make that mistake again. But anyway, she came down here and she moved around town and talked to people who had memories about the case, and ultimately she was able to find the family members in Memphis. And at that point, April and the Remembrance Committee became involved, and we left it to them to organize two utterly wonderful events in this town. The first one, she came back for both of them. The first one was bringing the family members, the wonderful Higginbotham family, which again, the families don't know the full stories. They don't have the documents. They don't have the newspaper articles. They know bits and pieces, and they're not going to run out and hire a lawyer and tell them, go up to Washington and get these documents for us. And so Kylene, along with my colleague from Vassar College, Diane Harraford, we work with Vassar students as well. They both came down here and met the full, beautiful family, including the patriarch who has since passed, and then came in as well for the second. So this is kind of the epitome of a successful, what we call RJ, Restorative Justice Project, which is our efforts are intended to return this material. I mean, they're obviously in the hoof and weft of American history as well, but we consider ourselves successful when it's not in our hands anymore. It's in the hands of the community where that event took place, and in the hands of that family. It becomes county history, state history, and it's for the folks in those places to do with it what they will, what seems most appropriate to them, along with those families.
One of the things I appreciate about your book, Margaret, is it doesn't leave us with the horror of just the details of this terrorism and violence and lynching. Your book also talks about and documents the courageous and significant resistance that occurred all along the way. Would you say something about that?
Well, what I will say is obviously resistance has characterized African American life in America since, I think the date that is out there now is 1619.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, our country, by the way, didn't start in 1619. Nor did the oppression in our country start in 1619. That needs a corrective. We're talking about 1492, right? But in any event, we all owe our own practice of resistance and our fights for broader democracy and for liberation to those who engaged in those fights before us. And in order best to take advantage of their example, we have to know what they did. And so in the course of this book, for example, in Birmingham, I talk about the ways in which memorials, funerals became sites of resistance. People couldn't necessarily hold demonstrations. They couldn't close down highways like the Black Lives Matter people do today. They just get shot down as they did on the Pettisbury Bridge. All right. So what they did was they held the funerals became places of both mourning and resistance. And I also talk about the ways in which, again, the labor movement becomes a source of resistance to the violence. I talk about not just formal methods and practices of resistance, not just the petitions and the trip down to City Hall and calling your white friend or your white employer, that sort of thing, but also less documented forms of resistance that were particularly practiced within female communities among African American women. So one of the beautiful things I found in the archives as I was looking in Washington was a file called the Negro Transportation File. During World War II, the folks who were running our war effort here at home realized they had to get black soldiers from place to place. And at some point they realized they were accumulating cases where soldiers were being harmed and in some cases shot and killed as they tried to move from place to place in the segregated towns. And so they, in order to get a handle on this, the Army, at that point it's the 5th Command, which was at Fort Benning in Georgia, opened up a project to interrogate bus supervisors all over the South, and to get them to record incidents of protest, violence that had to do with Jim Crow transportation. So, get this, folks. Instead of the Army, the War Department, I don't know. I have never managed a war. But instead of arguing to FDR and others, it's time to desegregate public transportation. What they did was try to manage the project. They were coming off of Plessy and Ferguson, the rule of Plessy and Ferguson, which they thought governed federal authority, federal spaces, as well as state and local spaces. And so in this Negro transportation file are all these stories about women who had to ride the bus and who protested in 1,000 different ways of asserting their humanity and trying to get from place to place, from their homes to their jobs as maids in these white communities. By the way, I don't think this man would mind me sharing this with you, but yesterday we were in Jackson, Mississippi, and I was telling this story, and he came up to me afterwards and he said to me, you know, in the 1950s, I was just a kid, and I had to ride the bus, and I'll never forget that I was 8, 9, 10 years old, sitting in the front of the bus, and the back of the bus would just be crowded with maids standing up because there were no seats left. And he said that left such an impression on me as a young person. And so, you know, obviously we're tracing a certain kind of trauma, but if you think about how this spreads, you know, like poison, as it were, to everybody affected. I just was so touched by that story of, he's a kid. Who is he going to tell? You know, and what is he absorbing from this image of him sitting in an empty white section of the bus while black maids stand up in the back? I'm sorry, what did you ask me?
You're a good storyteller. So one of the things I really, really appreciate about your book is that it doesn't leave us just hanging. There's a good chunk of, I think the last 2 chapters or sections talk about, okay, folks, what do you do with this? Now that you know, what do you do? And let's bring it home to Oxford. We've got a plaque. We've got a bench. We've got another marker out at the tree where Mr. Higginbotham was actually hung. We had a ceremony. Now, aren't we done?
You could be done. And I would say it's up to you. I mean, I would say, you know, this is a national project, but at the end of the day, it's a neighbor-to-neighbor project. It's a local project. And we're throwing the stuff out there. The cases are all out there. The names of the alleged perpetrators are all out there. And it's now for people, and, you know, I'm a scholar, so I'm looking for more scholarship to come out of this. I'm looking for new readings of this period of history to come out of this. I'm looking for someone to look at all of the cases that pertain to African Americans with disabilities and how they were treated during this period, shot because they were blind, shocked because they were suffering from a mental illness, shocked because they came home shell-shocked from the war and got caught up in a police incident, ended up dead. I'm looking for, you know, folks to pick up this history and write new versions of Jim Crow. And folks, you know, there are a lot of books written about Jim Crow. So, you know, you might say to yourself, why do we need another book? Well, you need another book because people haven't heard the stories. You need another book because every era has its own lens and its own concepts and theories that bring to bear, to give us greater insight and understanding and depth into this period. And so I hope that for scholarship, that's what my book will do. I hope that for communities, they will pick up this book and this archive and, you know, go to town. And maybe that's enough, but maybe it's not. And that's up to the communities that, now I obviously make the argument in this book that the families are due something. And I relate this to the contemporary discussion about reparations, on which our country is deeply divided, and deeply divided, not surprisingly, along race lines. But I say, no matter what your view is of reparations, it's hard to argue with the point that I make in the book, that this particular group of survivors/victims is especially entitled to some sort of repair. It can be symbolic repair, such as has happened in this wonderful town. It could also be material repair. And I argue why this group, because we know who they are, we know what happened to them, we know how our legal system failed them, and we know that the damages they endured are calculable with the tools that we have. And we also know that there is precedent in our own history. So the Civil Liberties Act, which was passed in the 1980s and signed by President Clinton, recognized that the internment of Japanese nationals and Japanese Americans during World War II was a gross human rights violation. And you know, no one's going to go off and send their kid to college on $20,000, but it is an acknowledgement that a wrong has been perpetrated against this group, and from the highest levels of our government, our Supreme Court, which endorsed the internment in the Korematsu case.
And I read just recently, Margaret, that we now know all of the names of the interned Japanese people.
Took that long.
Yeah. So, would you like to read something?
Sure.
from the book?
Thank you so much.
And then we'll
I'm gonna
have
tell you
questions.
That Barbara and I share a summer home. She's not going to tell you about it because she wants you to think she's in Oxford 24/7, 12 months a year. But she escapes from here when it's warm up north, and she goes to Martha's Vineyard. She and Bob, and they have a wonderful little. It used to be a little cabin, but they kept adding and adding and adding, and now it's a beautiful home in Oak Bluffs, Massachusetts. And my mom has a little cottage, still a little cottage, around the corner from Barbara. So she goes and she sits on her porch, as I'm sure she would sit on her porch.
That's right.
Right here in Oxford.
That's right. Porch sitting is an occupation. A summer occupation.
Okay, let me see if I can find this piece I want to read. Just give me a second.
That's all right. You can be thinking of your questions. Margaret finds just the right thing to read.
All righty. This is the epilogue of the book. After the murder of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis, Minnesota in 2020, a search of our archive of Jim Crow racial homicides revealed a striking but not shocking coincidence. A man of the same name was killed by a police officer in 1945. In October of that year, Thurgood Marshall received a letter from the secretary of the NAACP branch in St. Augustine, Florida, seeking an investigation into the, quote, untimely death of our brother, George Floyd, whom we believe to have met his death unjustifiably so, close quote. 46 at the time of his death, the other George Floyd, a turpentine worker, was accused of being drunk on a Saturday evening and thrown into a cell in the St. Augustine jail. Floyd's protest against the second invasive search at the jail so incensed the arresting officer that he beat Floyd to death in the presence of other detainees and the jailer. Just 2 documents have survived from which to render an accounting of the death of this killing: the investigation of the branch NAACP and George Floyd's Florida death certificate. It was not entirely unforeseeable that we would find this named fellow in our archive, pleading to be exhumed and put in conversation with the iconic inspiration for what would become known as the 2020 reckoning with Black death at the hands of the state. After all, the Equal Justice Initiative identified more than 4,000 lynchings in the United States between 1877 and 1950. George Floyd's fate would not register in the EJI's report. It was not a lynching. One might ask whether counting is even worth the candle if X is not ascertainable. In this case, we count for Floyd number 1 and number 2. We count because George Floyd's younger brother, Charlie Floyd, beseeched the local branch of the NAACP in St. Augustine to count. We count because the secretary of the branch wrote Thurgood Marshall in New York City and asked him to count. We count because Floyd's paternal grandfather, Robert Floyd, was born into slavery in 1852, and with his paternal grandmother, also born a slave, had 8 children. We count because across 4 generations of Floyds, the men worked in the woods chopping down the towering long-leaf pines that would build our country and tapping out the turpentine to seal the boards on the ships that would transport our nation's merchandise. And the women, they cleaned houses, raised children, ran make-do infirmaries, and took in laundry. We count because the Floyds' payday wages were their only asset, indebtedness their constant companion, and the perpetually incomplete project of slavery their grinding geography. We count because for the Floyds, the bonds of slavery were replaced by unyielding indigence and debt. Monetary debt, yes, but also the debt living within, quote, the calculus of blame and responsibility that mandated that the former enslaved both repay this investment with faith and prove their worthiness. We count because day after day, year after year, George Floyd worked in a forest alongside convicts whom he was only nominally freer than, from can't see in the morning till can't see at night, dipping turpentine. We count because George and Rosa lived in the back of a camp that looked more like a prison, forbidden to keep a car on the premises because they might flee, and because they labored under the constant scrutiny of white bossmen, even when the work was done. We count the years of sweat and blood, never calculated, never compensated. We count the suffering of the living and the savagery of the dying. We count because we do not know who preached George Floyd's funeral or where he is buried, or what happened to the man who killed him. We count and contest because George Floyd counted. Number 1 and number 2. Thank you.
So we'll open up for questions or comments, thoughts.
Okay,
Okay,
I'm not afraid to go first.
I don't know that.
Something interesting that you said, that have been debating where do we go next. We've been having strategy meetings on what do we do next now that we've done this. And one of the things that I thought about concerning E.J. Hickenbottom is that he also had land. Where did it go? Who benefited from that land? And that was my first thought on that. My second one was when you said that there were African American men who were actually murdered by, racist people, and it wasn't considered a lynching. We do have an open case here that he talks about Mr. Hill all the time about what happened to his brother, open case. And I know that this is in Worley Valley, the NAACP commercial and the Memphis Commercial Appeals are the only two papers that wrote about a lynching of Woodrow, I think, Wilson, and Worley Valley, Mississippi, who was beat to death by the sheriff after he caught him doing whiskey making, we call it?
Moonshine.
Yeah, moonshining. And he was beat to death, and he walked out of the courtroom and said, give me my Billy Jack or whatever, and so I can beat another nigga. So those were things that were not by lynching, but were killing. And the NAACP, as a matter of fact, called it just that. That was my comment.
Okay, so lynching, the term is complicated, especially for those of us who spend our lives trying to define things, which is what lawyers do. In the 1940s, 1940 actually, the NAACP sponsored a national conference at Tuskegee because the term was all over the map, and they needed some certainty for two reasons. Number one, they wanted to count, and they were counting. At Tuskegee, there were two scholars there, Monroe Work and his team, were trying to figure out, what the numbers looked like, following in the steps of Ida B. Wells. And as well, they were continuing to push the legislation that had failed in the 1930s through the 1940s, and so they wanted to know a definition of lynching. And so there were three elements that they used. They said, a person has to have died, he has to have died at the hands of a group, 3 people or more, and he has to have been killed in the service of something other than, I'm not going to butcher this, so let me not try to repeat exactly the definition, but something other than a personal grudge. It has to be in the service of, racial supremacy, for example, right? So that was their definition that they began to use, the 3 people or more. So if you use that definition, many of these cases would be considered lynching. Would a police case be considered a lynching? Probably not under that definition. With the case I just told you about, George Floyd, a lynching, probably, clearly not. So it's not in that EJI archive. So we now use the term, in a rhetorical way, and it serves that purpose, but it's also a sloppy way of for those who care about history, a sloppy way of describing the nature and the pathways of racial violence. The Congress just passed a bill, an anti-lynching bill, finally, but it doesn't help us with the definition because it just refers back to other statutes. So that's on the question of lynching. On the Woodrow Wilson case, I remember working with this material early in my project, and I'm not going to, I don't want to say anything that's not completely correct, but if I remember correctly, when the case resurfaced, and a reporter here was writing about it, I think he was really concerned about his reputation as a reporter in this town, writing about this case. all of which is to say that you know, folks are still worried about repercussions of telling these stories to today.
Yes.
They're worried. Let me finish one more thing. Then I'll get to the land thing. You know, we traveled to Minden, Louisiana. Minden, Louisiana, looking at a killing there. And we met with a high school teacher who's also the keeper of the history of that county. I can't remember the name of the county, parish. And he took us, you know, all these places have their local museums. He took us to the local museum. And there on the wall was a photograph from the 1940s of old Minden, the courthouse and all of that. And I said to him, I said, well, where'd that photograph come from? And he said it came from the John Jones murder case. John Jones was, in effect, lynched in Minden in the early 1940s. Federal government came down there, they tried a case, they didn't win it. But they, you know, they took these huge photographs to show the jury where the thing happened. So I said, oh, that's interesting. Is there anything in this museum about the John Jones case? No. Just a photograph of the courthouse. And the only reason it's there is because it shows old Minden, you know. And not only that, but this guy, you know, I was there with my student, and the guy was afraid to talk to us. You know, he said, let's go on the back street, not the front street of the town, because I don't want to be seen with you.
Yeah.
This is 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So we have work to do. On the question of those cases that have not, where people say, you know, heard tell, we do the best we can. That's all we can do. In every single one of our cases, we have a death certificate. You know, so heard tell is not in our archive. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, right? But we have to live with that.
Right.
And the reason we're living with it is because this history was not excavated earlier. These folks, we went straight into the civil rights movement in the 1950s, and then we had an armful of trouble to deal with. So we never look back to see, what was going on back then. Who's here to tell those stories? And so we lost a lot.
And the land.
The land. That's somebody else's project. And there's a scholar, legal scholar at the University of Texas. I will dig up his name for you.
Thomas.
Huh?
Thomas.
Okay.
Yeah.
We will get his name for you. But he is looking at land loss associated with violence. It's across our archive. But to build this archive, we could not stop and go back to people who trace land loss. And, it's across the archive. People tell a story. We have one story, a man out of Georgia who was farming, his name was Henry Gilbert, farming 100 acres. And the land was sold for, a penny an acre after he died after he was murdered and his family had to move. So that's across the archive. But someone else with some other resources will have to figure out how do we deal with that.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think Philip Dre had a book. I think it was At the Hands of Persons Unknown. I think that was the title. But that phrase, it seems like your title is playing on that, right? It's
Yeah,
revising
and
that.
your name is?
I'm Adam Gusso. I'm the harmonica player.
I
I'm gonna buy your book.
knew. I had another friend in here. You're trying to go incognito.
That's right.
Adam, by the way, one of our the first video we did had to be 10 years ago, and we did a video with 3 of our families, and we needed some local sounds. And there is some musicologists. I'm sorry, Adam, if I got it wrong about
You got the Henry Stuckey thing, right?
Yeah. Okay. So Adam did the soundtrack for that, which was utterly fabulous. But also, on that Bentonia Blues thing that I was telling you all about, Stucky, I want to make sure I got it right. So if I got it wrong in the book, look at how.
So my question is this, it's very tantalizing. It suggests, I mean, the titles is about the people who did these horrible things, at hands now known. Can you talk
So
a little?
he uses the title Hands Unknown. And again, as I say, you know, you have to keep revisiting this stuff. You just have to keep, he does a nice job. Buy my book, not his.
My question is,
He does a nice job. Phillips is the author's name.
I'd love to know more about what you discovered as you went with your students and others to these towns and began to poke around. I'd like to know what you found out about those hands. Did you find it suggests that in some cases there are people who are actually scared, maybe somebody's still alive, and I was thinking to myself, 1958, 59, were there 22-year-olds who participated in a lynching
Yeah.
who might still be subject to the laws?
So again, that's somebody else's project. It's going through all those photographs that, you know, you've seen the photographs of all the children and the mothers and the children and the picnic baskets and the lynching. And someone else will go through them and figure out who's who and that. That's not our job. So when I say hands now known, I use it metaphorically. Obviously, hands unknown comes from the coroner's reports, where they suggest even though 500 people are gathered out there in the forest when these things take place, we don't know who did it. Who knows? The guy hung himself, right? So that's hands unknown. But what I see when I say hands now known, I don't know. I'm not saying we know everyone who was there. I'm not even saying we know, who fired the gun or who lit the bonfire underneath the body. I'm not saying that, but we do know who the judges and the prosecutors and the police officers, all of whom took an oath, a professional oath, to do justice. We know who those people were. And this book is trying to tell that story. As much as it's obviously about the perpetrators, it's about the broader community that allowed this to transpire. And those are the hands I'm really, as I said, talking about more or less metaphorically, Adam. So good to see you again. John Robb?
Thomas Mitchell at Texas A&M.
Right. No, he's at
No, he's-
University of Texas.
No,
Oh, he moved?
Texas A&M.
Okay. John Robin, you have a question? Did you? No. Anyone else? Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I guess this question's sort of picking up on a couple of things that have come up, and I'm curious about the role of the state. I'm wondering if in your data, I wonder if are you able to calculate how often the perpetrators were connected to the state, like to state authorities, police officers, or state officials? Are you able to
for
tell?
sure. You can work through the archive, and you can plug in police officer, and the number of police officers will pop up. You can plug in coroner, and all the coroners in the archive will pop up. So go in there, hang out, and have fun, and not only find out who was there from the state, but also if there are sufficient evidence of Klan membership, you can go in there and find that out too. Obviously, we're relying on other authorities. We don't know ourselves, but if there are documents that assert that the individuals were members of the Klan, that sort of thing. So yeah.
So I guess
it won't. There'll be, as I say, there'll be a lot of. Someone will write a PhD about the involvement of state actors in Florida.
Thanks very much.
Will that be you or?
No,
one of your students?
I've already written my PhD.
All right. Yes.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask, how long you've been doing the restorative justice work, and what do you recall being the most staggering information, or what was brought to light, which was so very surprising to you, or something, you know, just some of the things that stand out that your students have gleaned from their work?
Well, so that's a great question. First of all, we've been doing this, we started the project in 2007. I'd say we started our restorative justice work in probably 2011, 2012. We started our various RJ projects across the country, across the areas where we work. And you know, the archives are always surprising. And so, you know, I described one, that Negro transportation file. But what I think, if I had anything to say about what was most surprising, it was the casual nature of the violence and the offenses that could lead to lethal consequences. Folks walking down the street too close to a white person, failing to say yes sir, failing to take their hat off in a hotel, carrying a rifle because you were intending to go hunting, but being on a public street and carrying a rifle, end up shot by a police officer. So it's not just folks who organized or who, you know, like Higginbotham, or who were intentionally engaged in work that would disrupt the status quo. It's also folks who just accidentally violated the Jim Crow norm. We have one case in which a fellow standing in line to go to the theater, and with his girlfriend, standing with his girlfriend, he and his girlfriend are laughing, and the cops are trying to get all the folks who are waiting to get into the black gallery in the theater. This is Bessemer, Alabama, I think, or one of those towns around Birmingham. They're trying to get all the folks going into the black gallery to line up in a neat line. And so this guy doesn't hear, his name is Jackson, doesn't hear the command line up. And so he continues to laugh. And the police officer says, "You heard me, line up." I'm sorry, police officer says to him, "What are you laughing at?" And Jackson says, he's a veteran, by the way, a veteran, "Can I laugh?" And the officer arrests him for disorderly conduct. 10 minutes later, in that police car, he's dead in the back of the police car. Over and over again. It's that kind of casual brutality visited on these communities, and the reverberations across the generations that we found. Well, I think I found most surprising, because we all have our images and ideas about, you know, it was a bad thing, Jim Crow, you know, it's a mark on our national reputation, and you know, as a bad time. But the relationship between law, violence, and Jim Crow, I think I didn't fully understand until we began digging in some of these files. And that's the story I try to tell in the book, which you all can obtain.
I don't know if this is a question or an observation, but I want to thank you for the wonderful work you've been doing for years. I'll never forget when Colleen Burt called me at home out of the blue in 2015. I was an editor here in the local paper and had written a column about the Higginbotham lynching. And I guess in her research, she came across that and just called me and just kind of was picking my brain about, you know, you think the community would be open to acknowledging this, and you know, so we just had this discussion. But anyway, over time and for 30-something years, I was a journalist and told a lot of stories, and it just over the years, I've thought about all the stories that have not been told, and why these stories aren't told. And as we've been doing this work here, we're hearing some of these stories, and it is such a challenge to, you know, how do you get people to talk about this? And, I don't know, Effie, your family has very personal stories, and it just, as you say, just the generational trauma that this might have caused, and I know has caused. And I was thinking in April when we had our event on the square, a white gentleman in town came up to me and just casually mentioned that, you know, he's got a piece of a rope that was used in a lynching here in town, and his, you know, his grandfather, I think it was, who was there, and you know, they kept this in the family, and it's just sort of astounding that what is all in this community that we haven't uncovered, and how can we go about bringing these stories to light.
Thank you so much for that. You all remember the postcard exhibition, what's it called, Sanctuary?
Without sanctuary.
Without Sanctuary, about 10 years ago, which was aimed at, you know, displaying these cards that people sent around, memorabilia of their presence at a lynching. And yes, we've heard this rope story. We've heard elsewhere. Folks, just, you know, what do you do with it? Do you throw it out? Do you give it to someone? Is it a museum piece? Where does it actually belong? So these are the physical objects, the ephemera, but then of course, obviously, you have the memories as well, which are equally important. And I thank you so much for the work you all are doing to reach folks. And you know, our approach was, let's go through the documents. Let's just get the documents out there and let the documents do some of the talking, and then others will add their memories on top of the documents. But there's a lot in the docs, and as I say, they've been publicly available, but sealed up there in NARA. So you know, you'd have to know how to use the web, know how to file a FOIA, know how when they reject you, you got to go back and ask again. When they send you the heavily redacted version, you guys, the journalists in the room, will know this. And again, on the storytelling piece of it, how do you get people to open up? That's what, you know, our job as fact finders, journalists, lawyers, scholars, that's what our job actually is, and just do it the best we can.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Margaret, I want to thank you for joining us. I want to encourage everyone to come get a book. And the last chapters of the book do contain some thoughts about how you might respond to people who say, oh, that was so long ago. Why do you want to talk about this? It's just so divisive. What are we supposed to do with this? It's just horror story after horror story. So the book is not just the horror stories, and there's some very provocative and thoughtful ideas at the end of the book that might help us in Oxford as we try to move into the 21st century.
Before you have the last word, let me just say that I get that question a lot. You know, it's a long time ago, and I'm like, every year there's another book about World War II. Every year. Sorry.
I'm glad you answered that. Thank you.
About 40 times every year.